moving on to the First Chronicles passage. Mr. Albrecht had cited First Chronicles 29:20, but this verse doesn't help him much. Why not? Because for one thing, there's no distinction made between Latria and Dulia there. It's not as though they give Latria to God and Dulia to the king. Even worse, for Mr. Albrecht's position, the verse just reports that the people did this. It doesn't condemn it, it doesn't condone it, it just reports it. So even assuming that the verse said that King David was the king here that's being referenced, and that they did bow down to King David, they did exactly the same thing to King David as they did to the Lord, which wouldn't support the idea of a distinction at all. It would simply point out that they were doing the same thing to both. Of course, it is possible that the people recognized the distinction and that the people were doing one thing to the king and another thing to God. It's very interesting that the Greek here uses a construction such that both the Lord and the king can be the same person. There's an article used before the Lord, and there's an article used before the king, but it doesn't specify King David, and it doesn't force it to be a reference to King David. So there's some ambiguity there. It's not a black and white case, but this same construction, using an article before both, is found in John 20:28, where Thomas answers and says, "My Lord and my God." In that case, it's not expressed in English, but the article is there before both Lord and God. And so, although of course Thomas is talking about just one person, so the fact that the word "and" is used there isn't conclusive. What's very interesting is the Vulgate. Of course, the Vulgate takes the position that they are two different people, but the Vulgate adds in a word. It says that they bowed to God and then to the king, which suggests that they were engaging in two different activities. But nevertheless, as I already mentioned in the cross-examination, bowing down before a king is one kind of respect that we can show that's different from respect in religious context. It's unclear how Mr. Albrecht believes that this religious context is applied to King David. As far as I know, there isn't any teaching in Aquinas that we are to give religious dulia to living, to non-glorified human beings. In fact, it's sort of unclear to me why either Galatians or First Chronicles is being cited as an example of why we would give dulia to Mary or the saints, because of course these are both examples of what we're giving to living people in this life before they're glorified. David, in fact, is a sinful man, and God wouldn't allow David to build the temple. But apparently, if we understood the argument that's made from 1 Chronicles 29:20, it's being suggested that religious dulia is appropriate for such a sinful man. This doesn't seem to be fully consistent with the doctrines of Catholicism. It leaves me somewhat confused. But the bottom line is this. We haven't seen from Scripture a distinction where Scripture approves or condones the religious veneration of departed believers. It doesn't approve or condone the religious veneration of Mary. In fact, it doesn't provide even one example in the whole of Scripture of anyone giving religious veneration to Mary. It doesn't give even one example in all of Scripture of religious veneration being given to the saints once they're departed from this life. Even if we would grant that Galatians permits religious veneration in this life, which is not something that Mr. Albrecht made. He said that all of our life is to be, or that love is very important, and it doesn't get any more religious than love. Then we've showed that love is a requirement for all of our life. But in any event, based on these illustrations from the verses that have been cited, I would respectfully submit that no case for a distinction between Latria and Dulia in a religious context has been established.
Okay, thank you, Turretinfan. Mr. Albrecht, you'll have the last rebuttal session, and this will be 4 minutes. You may begin when you're ready.
All right. In conclusion, we find that the Catholic claims are once again vindicated by Scripture. I wish you would have been able to delve into the early church, where I believe the Catholic position is ever so powerful also. But it's important that we were able to stick mainly to the Scriptures. We see that Latria and Dulia are two distinct words. We also see that the usage of Dulia in a religious context does not equal that of worship. The cold hard facts are there. The Bible distinguishes between Latria and between Dulia. Dulia can and is and always should be used in a worship context when referring to God. Latria, no doubt, is to be directed to God and to God alone. But Dulia is also shown as being proper towards mankind, even if one sets up the false parameters of a religious context. Dulia is still offered to man. The same can be said of PROSKUNEO as well. And to briefly touch upon some comments that Turretin made, he says that Jesus does say that we should serve and worship God only, and that is also the Catholic position, which I have already shown in the Bible. Duliuo in Galatians chapter 5, verse 13 and 14 is used towards mankind. It is in a religious context. And as far as me not understanding the Reformed position, as Turretinfan claims, I'd rather stick to the biblical position, which is, as I have already shown several times, PROSKUNEO and DULIA are used towards mankind in a religious context. In 1 Chronicles chapter 29:20, Turretinfan briefly attempted to deal with it. He said this was intended that this did not deal with the Latria and Dulia. Well, I was specifically dealing with the Greek term proskuneo, which is used in the Septuagint rendering of 1 Chronicles 29:20. And I indeed showed how this term is used in a religious context. I would contend that Turretin is incorrect about the Greek being clearly referencing somebody else. I think the whole context is clear that this is in reference to the king. The passage in as the passage is also mentioned in the Matthew Henry commentary, it pointed out that this is in reference to the God and to the king. And the Matthew Henry commentary is far from a Catholic commentary. And I believe the passage that Turretinfan brought up in John chapter 20, verse 28, where Thomas calls Christ his Lord and his God, in the Greek we literally read, and we are able to tell that he is calling him his Lord and his God, the Lord of him, the God of him. The Greek construct is completely different, as I just looked at right now. And in the passage in John, it's clear that this is in reference to Christ being his Lord and his God. Therefore, Turretin has shown that in order to try and answer away a religious context that I have shown, he must try and answer away a passage or try to claim that the passage has some ambiguity. But I believe clearly that 1 Chronicles chapter 29:20 is in clear reference to a religious context given to mankind as well. Someone would not be able to contend that proskuneo is never offered to anyone in a religious context. We would agree that proskuneo is never given to mankind in a worship sense, ever. It is not acceptable. But to claim that all religious contexts in the Bible deal with worship is simply plain silly. This is a religious context, and the people are not worshiping the king in any sense whatsoever. They bow down before God and offer respect to the king. To me, it doesn't get any more of a religious context than this, context-wise, of course. So it's important to understand the way a Catholic worships God and God alone, and gives honor and respect to the saints. No saint usurps the role of God in the Catholic faith. And I believe this debate is very important because it will, if anything, helps us understand our positions in a clearer fashion than any debate is profitable. And I would like to end by saying God bless, and I really appreciate this debate, and I think it's been very helpful.
Thank you for that, Mr. Albrecht. This now concludes the Latria Dulia debate with Mr. William Albrecht and Turretinfan of AOMen.org. Thank you, Mr. Albrecht and Turretinfan, for taking the time to debate the issues today. My name is Lane Chaplin. Thank you for listening.